Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you at a special time on Wednesday, Erev Christmas. We wish a Merry Christmas to our friends who are celebrating Christmas. So first, let me just start with a couple of apologies. Normally, when we have special time, we put up the notice, the reminder on Facebook. That didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen a lot, just we have some turmoil over here. Kids came in very late last night, returning home for the winter break. And Nina is quite under the weather. So dedicating today's show to a refuah shlema, a complete healing for my beloved bride, Nina. May she have a refuah shlema. And we say amen. And if I have to run out, that's what's going on. Don't worry, it doesn't seem to be anything serious, but it's just she caught something. And please God, she should have a refuah shlema now, please God. Okay, so with all that in mind, I'm just gonna, own up. I am not prepared. It's happened maybe twice in these 2,000 shows, but I have not read our daf today before teaching it, so we're learning it together. Please bear with me. Let's light up the darkness. Okay. Who's in the house? Karen in Northern California, Bill in Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill, thank you. May she indeed be healed. Amen. It is that time of year. Joe in the Inland Empire, amen. Chaim in Florida, Alan in New York City. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Our daf is 103 here in Tractate Zevachim, 29th volume of the Talmud. Right now, opening Mishna number 2 here in chapter 12, directly at the top of page 103a. Mishnah 2 of chapter 12. In the case of any burnt offering for which the altar did not acquire its flesh, for example, if it was disqualified prior to the sprinkling of the blood, right? So this burnt offering, if the owner of the burnt offering made a vow to bring a burnt offering, since it was disqualified prior to the sprinkling of the blood, he has not fulfilled his vow. We've learned that earlier. Here in the context of the gifts to the priests, right? In Mishnah 1, we were talking about the edible portions of the sin offering. Now we're talking about the hides, right? The hides of the animals. Those go to the priest. It's a gift to the priest specified in the Torah, but not if the offering was disqualified, right? So in the case of any burnt offering for which the altar did not acquire its flesh, for example, if it was disqualified prior to the sprinkling of its blood, the priests did not acquire its hide. As it is stated with regard to the burnt offering, and the priest that sacrifices a man's burnt offering, the priest shall have to himself the hide of the burnt offering that he has sacrificed. That's Leviticus 7:8. Indicating that the priest acquires only the hide of a burnt offering that satisfied the obligation of a man. Nevertheless, in a case of a burnt offering that was slaughtered not for its sake, but for the sake of another offering, although it did not satisfy the obligation of the owner, its hide goes to the priests. In addition, although the verse states a man's burnt offering, in the case of both the burnt offering of a man and the burnt offering of a woman, their hides go to the priests in both cases. The hides of offerings of lesser sanctity, right? Peace offerings, thanks offerings, belong to the owners, not the priests. The hides of the offerings of the most sacred order belong to the priests. The right of priests to hides of offerings of the most sacred order is derived by a kal v'chomer inference. if for a burnt offering for which the priests do not acquire its flesh, as it is burned in its entirety, they acquire its hide, right? They don't get to eat it because it's all burned on the altar, but they do acquire the hide. Then for other offerings of the most sacred order for which the priests do acquire its flesh, right, the edible portion of a sin offering, is it not right that they should also acquire its hide? And there's no room to contend that the altar will prove that this is not a valid inference, as it acquires the flesh of a burnt offering, but it does not acquire its hide, right? We don't burn the hides on the altar, since it does not have the right to the hide of an offering in any place. It's rather interesting terminology in terms of, and we've seen this in a bunch of places, right? The altar acquires. The altar has a right to, or what belongs to heaven, or sometimes even what heaven eats, right? Certainly what the altar eats, what the altar consumes. And it's really, it's not that we're anthropomorphizing the altar. We don't. The altar doesn't have thoughts, right? It is a location that God designated for the offerings to be brought when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, which it hasn't in 2,000 years. But this language is very useful to the sages to distinguish between what the altar acquires and what the priests themselves acquire, or what the owner of the offering acquires, depending on the type of offering and its various regulations. Okay, that's Mishnah 2. Now the Gemara. The sages taught in a Baraisa the phrase, a man's burnt offering, in the verse mentioned above, serves to exclude the burnt offering of consecrated property, meaning that the priests do not acquire the hides of such offerings. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says the phrase serves to exclude the burnt offerings of converts. Burnt offerings of converts, right? Here's a note on the halacha. If one consecrates a burnt offering for temple maintenance, right? So kind of interesting, right? Because normally you can consecrate an animal, right, for temple maintenance. So what does that mean? That you would donate that animal to the temple, right? That it's for the running of the temple. It's like you're donating to the nonprofit that runs the temple, so to speak. And then the temple would sell that animal, right? And then the money would go into the treasury so that they could, hire carpenters and maintenance men and all the different things that the temple needs. So I'm not sure what it means, a burnt offering for temple maintenance, or if one consecrates all his property, including an animal that is fit for a burnt offering, then the priest does not acquire the hide of the burnt offering, rather the hide is sold, and the money is allocated for temple maintenance. Very good. So when you consecrate an animal as a burnt offering for temple maintenance, what does that mean, right? The animal is going to be burned up on the altar. You donated the animal. But the hide, which never goes up on the altar, that is sold. And instead of going to the priest, it goes into the coffers of the treasury for temple maintenance. That's the difference. Rather, it's sold and the money is allocated for temple maintenance. And this is in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yehuda and its interpretation by Rabbi Yanai and Rav Hamnuna, as we shall see. And an additional note on this, one who consecrates a burnt offering for temple maintenance. This is known as consecration by valuation. We'll learn that in Tamura 32a. An offering that is consecrated for the altar must be sacrificed on the altar. Therefore, if an animal consecrated as an offering is then consecrated for temple maintenance, that's another wrinkle in this. He already consecrated it as to be an offering, and then he also consecrated it for the temple maintenance, right? So it must have been a mistake. He didn't have the right to do that. I'm surprised that his words have any meaning at all. Let's keep reading. If he's already consecrated to be a burnt offering, he's no longer the owner of that animal. He's a caretaker, and he has to bring it as an offering. But let's say he said those words, what then happens, right? Therefore, if an animal consecrated as an offering is then consecrated for temple maintenance, its monetary value is appraised and the owner pays that amount to the temple treasury, right? His words have significance. And of course, you learn that in Tamura, right, where we're studying that if you consecrate an animal, then you try to consecrate another animal as its substitute. And what do we learn about that? That both animals become consecrated. Both have to be brought as an offering. So where you've got an animal already consecrated and you try to consecrate it to a different purpose, okay, well, you're going to then satisfy the needs of that purpose by valuing the animal and giving that much more money. The monetary value of the burnt offering is appraised as follows. If the owner consecrated the animal as a vow offering, in which case he is obligated to pay restitution if the animal dies or is stolen, then he pays the full value of the animal. If he consecrated the animal as a gift offering, in which case he is exempt if the animal dies or is stolen, right? This is the difference between somebody who consecrates, I'm going to bring an animal, right? Bli neder, I'm not saying this, but if a person said, I'm going to bring an animal to the altar, right? And he's thinking of this animal, but then if that animal dies, he has to bring a different animal. But if he consecrates that particular animal to bring it, he has to bring that animal as an offering, but if it dies, he doesn't have to replace it, right? That's the difference between a vow offering and a gift offering. Then he pays the monetary value. So in the case of the gift offering, where he doesn't have to replace the animal, if he then, having consecrated, consecrates its value to the treasury, then he still is going to have to pay extra money, but how does he appraise it? Then he pays the monetary value of his benefit of discretion, i.e. his discretion to give the offering to any priest of his choice. Interesting. What is that worth? Right? This is the same, by the way, with all tithing, right? When you're talking about not temura, which is substitution, but teruma, the first 2% of produce that goes to a priest, a person, a farmer, right, who's going to give that produce, that teruma, the consecrated gift to a priest. He chooses which priest. He can pick any priest he wants. What is the value of that benefit of discretion, of his ability to choose? That's for another day. Okay. And when I say what is the value, I don't mean like it seems to me like it's valueless. No, I'm saying like what is the monetary value of that? How would we appraise that? It's a very interesting question that we're going to do for another day. Okay. The Gemara clarifies. What does Rabbi Yehuda mean when he says that the phrase serves to exclude the burnt offering of consecrated property? Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef says he means it serves to exclude a burnt offering that comes from property that was left over. So for example, if an animal consecrated as a guilt offering remains alive after its owner has achieved atonement by sacrificing a different animal. So now the owner must wait until this animal acquires a blemish, which means it's disqualified from being brought as an offering, and then he can sell it, and the proceeds are used to purchase a communal gift offering, which is sacrificed when there are no other offerings to be burned on the altar. We'll learn that in Tamura 20b. Now, because it is a communal offering, it is not considered a man's burnt offering, and the priests therefore have no right to the hide. So the Gemara asks, this works out well according to the one who says leftover consecrated property goes toward communal gift offerings. But according to the one who says leftover consecrated property goes toward an individual's gift offering, then what can be said? As this is a man's burnt offering, the priest should have a right to the hides, right? So again, if it's a burnt offering of an individual, the priest who brings that offering gets the hide. But if it's a communal burnt offering, the priests don't get the hide. So the Gemara answers according to that. So now we get into that gray area. The Gemara answers according to that opinion, the law is as Rava says. The verse states, and the priest shall kindle wood on it every morning, and he shall lay the burnt offering in order upon it. Leviticus 6:5. So the verse states burnt offering the verse states the burnt offering, right? Ha'olah. With the definite article, the, to teach that the daily burnt offering is the first burnt offering sacrificed each day in the temple. Now, if we're talking about a daily offering, is this an individual's offering or a communal offering? Communal, right? It's being brought on behalf of the nation. Here, too, The verse states, the priest shall have to himself the hide of the burnt offering which he has offered, to teach that the priest acquires the hide of a first burnt offering, i.e. an animal that was initially designated as a burnt offering, but not of a burnt offering purchased from proceeds left over from another offering. And we just explained why that would happen. So Rabbi Ivu says, that Rabbi Yanai says, Rabbi Yehuda's statement can be interpreted differently. The phrase, a man's burnt offering, serves to exclude a case of one who consecrates a burnt offering for temple maintenance. Since the owner seeks to shift its ownership to the temple, the priests have no right to its hides. The Gemara comments, it is not necessary to teach this law according to the one, and that is where the law ended up, right? I'm going to keep reading. It is not necessary to teach this law according to the one who says that consecration for temple maintenance applies by Torah law to offerings that were already consecrated to the altar, as the animal, in fact, ceases to belong to the individual, right? That's where I started this discussion. And the priests clearly have no claim to its hide. Rather, even according to the one who says that it does not apply by Torah law, because the offering is already consecrated for the altar, this matter applies only to the meat. But as for the hide, the consecration for temple maintenance does apply and nullifies the priest's claim to it. Right. Remember where we started is if the altar acquires the flesh, the priest acquires the hide. Right? If the flesh isn't going to go up as a burnt offering, the priest won't get the hide. But there's other ways that the priest won't get the hide, like if the owner of the offering is the temple, because it was consecrated as a burnt offering to the temple. Right? Then what that means is the altar acquires the flesh, but the hide goes to the temple treasury, who sells it, right, and then turns it into money used to run the affairs of the building. Now, the Gemara returns to the explanation of Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef and comments. And so says Rav Nachman that Rabbi bar Abu says, the phrase, a man's burnt offering, serves to exclude a burnt offering that comes from property that was left over. Rav Hamnuna said to Rav Nachman, in accordance with whose statement is your opinion? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. But didn't Rabbi Yehuda retract this statement? As it is taught in a Baraisa, the Mishna in Tractate Shekalim, 6.5, right? That's one of the tractates that is in the Mishnah, but not in the Gemara. That's why you have a reference like 6.5 rather than, page 65a or b, something like that, right? So the Mishnah in Tractate Shekalim states that the temple had 6 collection boxes shaped like horns for communal gift offerings. And these funds would go toward burnt offerings that come from money that was left over. So for example, if someone dedicated money to purchase an offering, and after his purchase, some of the sum remained, right? Instead of saying, I'm going to bring a sheep, right? Instead of saying that he was going to bring a sheep, he said he's setting aside 1,000 shekels to purchase, an ox, a bull, to bring as an offering. It ends up costing 800. But he didn't say he's going to bring a bull or he's going to bring a calf, he's going to bring an animal. He set a number, right? So since he was able to purchase a very fine animal, the finest probably he could find, and there was still money left over, that money remains consecrated, and so this would go into this collection box for communal gift offerings. So for example, if someone dedicated money to purchasing an offering and after his purchase some of the sum remained, he would put it in these boxes. And the law is that the priests have no right to the hide of such an offering. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Nehemiah said to Rabbi Yehuda, and some say that Rabbi Shimon said to him, if so, you have nullified the interpretation of Yehoiada the priest, as it is taught in a Mishnah in Shekalim 6.6, that Yehoiada the priest taught this interpretation. The verse states, it is a guilt offering. He is certainly guilty before the Lord. That's Leviticus 5:19. Now we're talking about the owner, the person who is obligated to bring a guilt offering. The phrase before the Lord teaches that if any money comes on account of a sin offering or on account of a guilt offering, i.e., right, he had to bring a sin offering, he set aside money to do it. It was more money than he needed once he purchased the animal, so that's leftover money that's still consecrated. On account of a sin offering or on account of a guilt offering, i.e., it is left over after their purchase, burnt offerings must be purchased with it. Now, right, he might only have $10 left, not nearly enough to purchase a whole animal for this burnt offering. That's why he puts it in these boxes where these kinds of leftover funds of many people combine together so that communal burnt offerings can be purchased with it. And the flesh of these offerings must be burned on the altar to the Lord. But the hides of those animals go to the priests, right? Now this totally contradicts what Rabbi Yehuda says. This is Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion. And Rabbi Yehuda did not respond, indicating that he conceded that the hides of such offerings go to the priests. Rav Nachman said to Rav Hamnuna, but how does the master interpret the phrase, a man's burnt offering? What does that mean? And Rav Hamnuna said to him, I interpret it as referring to one who consecrates all his property, including animals fit for burnt offerings. If these animals are later sacrificed as burnt offerings, the priests do not acquire the hides, since the offerings are consecrated property. Right? Earlier I stated the obvious case. He had consecrated an animal to be an offering, and then he forgot that, and he consecrated again, as a gift to the temple for the temple maintenance. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. I already consecrated that animal, so now I'm going to have to appraise it and give that amount of money to the temple treasury and bring this animal as an offering. That's kind of the obvious case. A different situation, right, is where somebody says all his property, that itself is like, that makes him a pauper, right, if you consecrate all your property, which is problematic in itself. But let's say that a man, he has a beautiful home in the city, and he's a gentleman farmer, and he's got this ranch in the country, and he's getting older, and he's like, you know what? My grandkids live in the city. I'm going to stay in the city. I don't need the country place anymore. And he consecrates all of it, right? All of it. The whole country place with everything on it. So there's a house, there's property. The temple doesn't need to own a house, so that's going to get appraised, sold. That money will go to the temple. And there are animals there, right? Now, I don't know. Now they've all been consecrated. So there are animals that are fit to be burnt offerings. That doesn't mean they're consecrated as burnt offerings, but all that property has been consecrated, right? So if he then says, I'm going to bring this animal and tries to consecrate that, kind of in reverse, it's all been consecrated, and then he tries to consecrate the animal, or somebody else comes along and does that, I'm not sure that just because the animals are fit to be offerings, they need to become offerings. But since it is all consecrated, the person who's put in charge of, appraising and liquidating everything that's been appraised so that it can be delivered to the temple might designate some of the animals to be brought as offerings. I'm not sure how that would go. But it's all been consecrated is the point. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. As we learned in the Mishna, Shekalim 4:7, if one consecrates his property without specifying the purpose, generally speaking, it goes toward temple maintenance. Okay, here's my question being answered immediately. But if among it were animals fit to be sacrificed on the altar, either male or female, then Rabbi Eliezer says animals that are fit for offerings must be sacrificed. There you go. That's how it's designated. They must be sacrificed. Since he consecrated all that property, if they're animals fit to be sacrifices, they get brought as sacrifices. Animals that are fit for offerings must be sacrificed when all the property has been consecrated in that general manner. Therefore, the male animals shall be sold for the purpose of burnt offerings to those who need to bring such offerings, and the female animals which cannot be brought as burnt offerings shall be sold for the purpose of peace offerings to those who need to bring such offerings. Right? It's not that okay, he had a bunch of animals on the farm. Some of them are fit to be burnt offerings. And so we're just going to march them into the temple, slaughter them, and offer them up as burnt offerings. No. They've been consecrated as a donation to the temple. So the ones that are fit to be burnt offerings are going to be sold to people who need to bring burnt offerings. And the proceeds go to the temple treasury. And because they were consecrated for temple maintenance, their proceeds shall be allocated with the rest of the person's property for temple maintenance. So Rabbi Yehoshua says, the donor intended that all animals fit for sacrifice be brought as burnt offerings and the rest of his property be given for temple maintenance. Therefore, the males shall be sacrificed themselves as burnt offerings and the females shall be sold for the purpose of being sacrificed as peace offerings. Right? Rabbi Yehoshua is going the other way. He says, no. You're not going to sell the male offerings to people, the male animals, to people who need animals for burnt offerings. The donor intended the male animals on his ranch to be brought as burnt offerings. So the temple will not receive that as funds for maintenance. The priest will just sacrifice the male animals. The females will be sold to become peace offerings because peace offerings are taken from female animals. And he shall bring burnt offerings with the proceeds of the sale of the female offerings to people who need to bring peace offerings. And the rest of the property shall be allocated for temple maintenance. And Rav Hamnuna explains, and even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that a person divides his consecrated property as he rules that the animals are themselves sacrificed while the other property is given for temple maintenance, this statement applies specifically to the flesh, which is fit to be burned on the altar. But as for the hide, which is not, the fund for temple maintenance acquires it from the outset, and the priests therefore have no right to it. This is the law that Rabbi Yehuda derives from the phrase, a man's burnt offering. All of that from the fact that the Torah says, a man's burnt offering. Right? What's he talking about? That it belongs to a man. And what are the implications of talking about property and ownership in the context of consecration of offerings? Here in our discussion, in the context of when do priests receive the hide, specifically is if an individual, right, sends in a burnt offering and achieves, the sacrifice. If he vowed to bring it, his vow is fulfilled, then priests get the hide. But when it was donated to the temple in some way, if it ends up somehow the property of the temple, then the priests don't get the hide. Now, the Brisa states, Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says, the phrase, a man's burnt offering, serves to exclude the burnt offering of converts. What does that mean? The priests do not acquire the hides of such offerings. Rav Simai Bar Chilke said to Ravina, is that to say that a convert is not included in a category of a man? Ravina said to him, Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, meant that the verse serves to exclude the burnt offering of a convert who died and has no heirs, right? Because when somebody converts to Judaism under Jewish law, his family is no longer his family. Now, that doesn't mean he can't go have holiday dinners with them and enjoy himself and have a very, very beautiful relationship, right? But his relatives under Jewish law are not his heirs when it comes to disposing of property under Jewish law, right? So if he didn't leave a will, then his property, in the Holy Land under Jewish law, if he has no heirs. Now, if you convert and have children, those are your heirs, right? Because you had those children after you converted. If you have children and you convert, your children are not your heirs, right? They can become your heirs. If you want to raise them Jewish, they're going to need to convert also. And then you're going to designate them to be your heirs. I mean, there's all kinds of nuances of that. But here they're just talking about that general thing that a convert, does not have heirs automatically. He's going to have to, make that happen. But in the absence of a will under Jewish law, his former relatives are not his heirs. Now, the sages taught in a Baraisa, the verse states, and the priest that offers a man's burnt offering, the priest shall have to himself the hide of the burnt offering that he has sacrificed. Leviticus 7:8. Okay, back to basics. From this verse, I have derived the law only with regard to a man's burnt offering, And here we're talking about a born Jewish male. From where is the same derived with regard to the burnt offerings of converts, women, or Canaanite slaves? The verse states the hide of the burnt offering, and it thereby included their burnt offerings as well. And if so, why did the verse write a man's burnt offering? It serves to teach that the priest acquired the hide only of a burnt offering that satisfied the obligation of a man, i.e. to exclude a burnt offering that was slaughtered with the intention of consuming it beyond its designated time or outside its designated area and was thereby disqualified, right? Pigul. So if at the outset, at the time that it was slaughtered, the person slaughtering had in mind that the priests would eat, or if it was a peace offering that he would eat, beyond the deadline, so that's already disqualified. Therefore, right, we should not complete that offering. That's why we would say the altar did not acquire the flesh, and of course the priest therefore did not acquire the hide. And the verse teaches that the priests have no right to the hide of such an offering if it was disqualified by that process. One might have thought that I include a burnt offering that was not slaughtered for its own sake, but for the sake of another offering. Right? This is either at the time of slaughtering, the person who's slaughtering thinks that he is bringing a sin offering for Bob, but in fact, this is an animal that belongs to Pete. Right? He's not bringing Bob's offering, he's bringing Pete's offering, but he had it wrong. That could disqualify it. Also, if it was Bob's sin offering that he's thinking, but actually Bob was sending in a burnt offering, that could disqualify it. We learned that right at the beginning of the tractate. One might have thought that I include a burnt offering that was not slaughtered for its own sake, but for the sake of another offering, since it does not satisfy the obligation of the owner. Now we're on page 103b. I might have thought that the priests have no right to its hide. Therefore, the verse states the hide of the burnt offering to teach that in any case where the offering is not disqualified, the priest acquires its hide, even if it did not satisfy the owner's obligation. Interesting, right? We did see that certain offerings, once you have the wrong offering in mind, full stop. Sin offering and Pesach. But burnt offering, if you have the wrong offering in mind, or I think even the wrong person, it doesn't satisfy the owner's obligation, but it completes its journey to the altar. And if it completes its journey to the altar acquired the flesh, therefore the priest acquires the hide. And from the phrase, the hide of the burnt offering, I've derived only that the priest acquire the hide of the burnt offering. From where do I derive that they acquire the hides of all offerings of the most sacred order, sin offerings and guilt offerings? The verse states the hide of the burnt offering which he has offered, which serves to include any offering that the priest sacrifice. If so, one might have thought that I include even offerings of lesser sanctity, peace offerings, thanks offerings, bechor, etc. Therefore, the verse states burnt offering and not simply offering, to teach that just as a burnt offering is an offering of the most sacred order, so too the priests acquire the hides only of all offerings of the most sacred order. They do not acquire the hides of offerings of lesser sanctity. Who acquires those hides? The owner of the offering. The Brisa continues, Rabbi Yishmael says there is a different derivation. From the phrase, the hide of the burnt offering, I've derived only that the priests acquire the hide of the burnt offering. From where is it derived that they acquire the hides of all offerings of the most sacred order? It is based on a logical inference. Just as in the case of a burnt offering, for which the priests do not acquire its meat, the priests nevertheless acquire its hide. Then, in the case of offerings of the most sacred order for which the priests do acquire its meat, is it not logical that they acquire their hides? It's a nice kal v'chomer. We said it earlier today. One may object to this kal v'chomer. Let the altar prove that this is not a valid kal v'chomer, as it acquires the meat and it still does not acquire the hide. Right? The altar acquires the meat of a burnt offering, but the hide goes to the priest. The altar does not acquire it. One may respond, what is notable about the altar? It is notable in that it does not acquire hides ever. Hides are not burned on the altar. And by the way, what a nice thing that Hashem did in spelling this out in the Torah. Because if you burn the flesh of these animals on the altar, okay, so the temple smells like steak, right? It smells like a barbecue. If you burn the hide, I mean, we bring sheep, right? If you bring a sheep with its hide on the altar, all that wool is going to burn. If you bring a goat, there's goat hair. If you bring a calf, or an ox, that skin and that hair, it's not going to smell good in the Holy Temple. Nice feature of the fact that the hides are never burned on the altar. It does not, right? Let the altar prove one. It acquires the meat, and it does not. The altar acquires the meat, but it does not acquire the hide. I'm sorry. So what is notable? That the altar does not acquire hides ever. Now, will you say the law concerning the altar should teach the law concerning the priests who acquire the hides of some offerings and don't acquire the hides of others? Why are we learning out from the altar? The altar never acquires a hide. Why would we look to a teaching about the altar to establish what the law is of when priests acquire hides and when they don't? Since the altar never acquires hides. Good objection. Rather say, since the priests acquire hides of some of the offerings, they acquire the hides of all the offerings of the most sacred order. Rebbe says there is no need to derive that hides of offerings of the most sacred order go to the priests. We need the verse itself only to teach that this is the law with regard to the hide of the burnt offering, as the Torah does not generally require that an offering be flayed. In all other cases, the hide of the offering follows the flesh of the offering. Okay. I just take back what I said a moment ago. What? Now I'm confused. Okay. I'm not sure what Rebbe's talking about. Here's the note on the side. The hides of all offerings are flayed, and then the portions to be consumed on the altar are removed. The exception is sin offerings that are burned, which are not flayed at all. But sin offerings that are burned, remember, what are they? Those are sin offerings whose blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary, right? When the Sanhedrin makes an error, when the high priest makes an error, that lead a goat if it leads to idolatry, or when the Sanhedrin makes an error that the population relies on, and with those special offerings whose blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary, those are burned in their entirety. Where? Not on the altar. Not on the altar. Those are taken to another place to be burned. So my observation stands. They were not burning hides on the altar ever, so they would not have that smell. Okay. So says Rebbe, the Torah, but what Rebbe is saying is the Torah does not generally require that an offering be flayed. In all other cases, the hide of the offering follows the flesh of the offering. For example, bulls that are burned and goats that are burned must be burned themselves and their hides burned with them, as the Torah states explicitly, Leviticus 4, verses 11 and 12. A sin offering, a guilt offering, and a communal peace offering are given as a gift to the priest. If the priests want, they may flay them and use the hides, and if they do not want to use the hides, they may eat the offerings together with their hides. Well, they could cook the skin. Okay. Offerings of lesser sanctity are given to the owners. If they want, they may flay them and use the hides, and if they want, they may eat the offerings together with their hides. Does anybody do that? Sounds gross. But with regard to a burnt offering, it is stated, and he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces, right? About the burnt offering, since the altar acquires the flesh, the Torah is also specifically saying it shall be flayed, right? Take the hide removed. One might have thought that because all the flesh of the burnt offering is burned on the altar, the priests have no right to its hide. Therefore, the verse states, and the priest shall have to himself the hide of the burnt offering that he has sacrificed. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The phrase, the priest shall have to himself, serves to exclude a priest who immersed that day. Talking about that yesterday, right? A priest who became tameh. Let's say, for example, he came into contact with a dead creeping thing, a sheretz. He has to immerse in the mikvah, but he won't be considered tahor, ritually pure, until nightfall. He is known as a tevel yom, awaiting nightfall. So the phrase, the priest shall have to himself, serves to exclude the tevel yom, And the priest who has not yet brought offerings, right? If he was a Nazir and he's completing his purification, where he not only has to immerse, wait for nightfall, he has to wait for the next day and bring his offerings. Also, one who is a Mitzorah, and only once those offerings are brought is he fully pure, and therefore fit to serve as a priest in the temple again. And so the Tevel Yom and the priest who has not yet brought offerings for his purification, and the Oinen, the acute mourner, right? They don't get portions of the sin offering to eat, and apparently they don't get hides of burnt offerings. This serves to exclude the Tevel Yom, the one who has not yet made atonement with an offering, and the acute mourner, meaning that they do not receive a share of the hides, just as they do not receive a share of the meat. As one might have thought that although these priests will not acquire the meat, this is because it is for consumption, and they are not permitted to partake of it because they're tameh. But you might have thought they will acquire the hide, since it's not for eating, and a tameh person can purchase a hide and own it. Therefore, the verse states, shall have to himself to exclude a priest who has not yet brought an atonement offering, and a Tevel Yom, and an acute mourner. The Gemara asks, but let the first Tana also derive the law logically, as Rabbi Yishmael did. Why did he cite a verse? And the Gemara answers, often when there is a matter that can be derived through a kal v'chomer inference, the verse nevertheless takes the trouble and writes it explicitly, and we'd rather just follow the written explicit verse in the Torah. And as for Rabbi Yishmael, what does he do with this phrase, the hide of the burnt offering that he has sacrificed, from which the first Tana derives this law? He holds that it serves to exclude a priest who immersed that day, the Tevel Yom, and the priest who has not yet brought the atonement offering, and the acute mourner. Gemara challenges this. But let Rabbi Yishmael derive this law from the phrase, shall have to himself, as does Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe. And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Yishmael conforms to his line of reasoning, that the phrase teaches a different law. As Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, it is stated, shall have to himself, in Leviticus 7:8, with regard to a burnt offering, and it is stated, the priest that makes atonement, he shall have to himself, in Leviticus 7:7, with regard to a guilt offering. So the following verbal analogy is derived from here. Just as there, after the blood of the guilt offering is presented, its bones become permitted to the priest for any use, since only the portions intended for consumption on the altar are sacrificed, whereas the rest of the animal is given to the priests. So too, here with regard to the burnt offering, its bones that are not attached to the flesh and are therefore not intended for the altar are permitted, right? So if the hide comes with certain bones that were removed from the portions that go up on the altar, all the flesh goes up on the altar, but that doesn't mean that every bone has to go up on the altar. And the bones that don't go on the altar go to the priests along with the hide. With regard to this verbal analogy, the Gemara comments, it must be that those items are free, i.e. superfluous, we're talking about these words and these phrases in these verses, are superfluous in their context and therefore available for the purpose of establishing a verbal analogy. Right? In other words, if a word is teaching you a specific law, then it's not free to make a linkage to another verse that contains the same word so that we can borrow some of the laws that apply there to this context. Right? If the word is needed to teach its own law, it's not free for the verbal analogy. As if they are not free, the verbal analogy can be refuted as follows. What is notable about a guilt offering? It is notable in that its meat is permitted to the priest, unlike the flesh of a burnt offering, which is burned upon the altar. And perhaps this is why the bones of the guilt offering are also permitted. Since the phrase, shall have it to himself, is a superfluous term in each verse, the analogy does work because a verbal analogy based on free terms cannot be refuted using logic. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 12. And we'll pick it up tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, with Mishnah 3 in chapter 12. Let me take a couple of comments and questions. Bill, to be sure, of course, we aren't anthropomorphizing the altar, but for my own part, I can't help hear an echo of the language of Psalms, where the hills and the mountains dance to praise God, the rivers and the streams clap their hands to praise God. There definitely is a degree in the biblical worldview to which we are encouraged to see all of the creation engaging in the work of worship of God. If the wild places do so, how much more the holy altar itself? And if the natural world and the animals and the mountains and the rivers and the streams all clap hands and praise God, and the altar does its work in praising God, how much more we, who are the only thinking beings in the creation that we know of, and who can understand that we are created by God in heaven and who have been commanded to love and praise God, how much more must we lift our hands and clap hands and sing and praise and thank our Creator above every day. Beautiful Kal Vachomer, Bill. And let's just take it even that much further. And I do love that language, absolutely. We see it in the Hallel sequence. Psalm 113 and 114, right? The mountains skip like rams, etc. Well, it's a little bit different, right? I was just thinking about this the other day. It's slightly different than what you're saying, because at Mount Sinai, right, at the Revelation, right, it says that the hills skipped like lambs, right? And like, what does that mean? To me, I think that there's, in part, I think what you're saying, that all of the creation is rejoicing in the Lord. And in the Gemara, I mean, many places, we have this understanding that, the sea made a deal with God that, like the sea of reeds that would eventually split and let the Jewish people through and pass, and then drown the oppressors in it, and conversations between the sun and the moon and God, right? That originally there were two luminaries of equal brilliance, and the moon said, how can there be two? How can two heads wear one crown? And then the moon was diminished, but then the moon was sad, and so God said, yeah, but the moon will be in charge of the calendar, right? We look to the moon for the Hebrew months. Things like that, right? That kind of anthropomorphizing for these discussions in the Midrash. But I think also when we talk about at the revelation at Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments and the Torah, and God revealing God's self to the people, to 2 million people, I think there was this sense that reality became a little bit, untethered from its fixed station, right? And so when God causes God's self to be manifest, it's almost like in the movie The Matrix, right? It's like you can see that it's all made of energy. It's all made of light, right? The whole universe is made of light. I mean, Einstein actually showed that. But it's all made of God's light. That's why the Bible begins, let there be light, right? That is, everything is made out of a spiritual energy that God sends into the universe, and then God sent physical laws with it. So we think that this bell, is solid, this wood desk is solid, but actually, at the atomic level, there's all kinds of empty space there. And sometimes, right, it's sort of like that spirituality pokes through, and this is when you get that glimpse beyond the veil. And so I think that is not only limited to events like that, when it was just 2 million people saw it all at once. Okay, there's never been anything like that, but there are times in our own lives when we can glimpse into the spiritual nature of our surroundings. We can see it almost throbbing with light. I'll just share with you guys that we're working on the script for our next movie now, which takes place in biblical times. I've mentioned this before, and I'm thinking about the visual scheme as a director, and I want to get on film this idea that there are times when the hardness of reality gives way a little bit to its true nature, which is all a beautiful light and loving energy from Hashem. We'll leave it at that. Karen, I wonder if people in priest families had side businesses in hides and leather goods. Excellent question, right? Because if it's a gift to the priest, okay, how many leather coats and pairs of shoes does he need? I mean, it's a gift to him. Well, he's a priest, okay? He's serving in the temple 2 weeks a year on his mishmar, and then another 2 weeks maybe during holidays. The rest of the year he lives somewhere else, probably in one of the Levitical cities. And what does he do? I mean, maybe he's a doctor. Maybe he's a merchant. Maybe he's a trader. But nothing to do with leather. But he gets all these hides. So what's he going to do with them? He's probably selling them to a craftsman who can do stuff with them. And maybe some of them actually got involved in the leather business. Why not? The point being that if something is a gift to the priest, then he owns it. And once he owns it, unlike the meat of the sin offering, which must be eaten in the holy temple, but the hides, I think, become full property of the priest, and they can do whatever they want with it. And finally, Sharon, if someone consecrated their property but says, I don't want to consecrate the animals, can those animals remain on the property, or is it assumed that consecrated land includes the animals with the property? Great question. So he didn't, first of all, he couldn't say, I consecrate everything, but I don't consecrate the animals. That could be a problem because he already consecrated everything. But let's say that he's saying, I'm going to keep my animals, but I'm consecrating everything else. Okay, so then what? Well, now that property has to be liquidated. And then, there's going to be new owners. Until then, do the animals stay there? And then what? I mean, if it's kind of like a working farm, but, right, all of the, the barn full of feed for those animals now no longer belongs to the owner of the animals. So he's going to have to pay, I would think, the temple treasurer for any benefit he receives in order to keep taking care of those animals. So it's up to him. He can just take the animals away. But if he leaves them there, now it used to be his property, now it belongs to the temple. So he's going to have to pay for any benefit he derives from that property. Housing the animals, feeding the animals, watering the animals, etc. That's how I would interpret that. That's what I've got for us today. God's help. See you tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific. And for our friends who celebrate Christmas, have a very, very Merry Christmas. It should be healthy and uplifting. And look forward to learning with you tomorrow.